коллеги, дорогие друзья. Очень приятно вас видеть.
So, I'm happy to see you, my dear colleagues. My name is Alfonso, and today I will be speaking English.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Да, спасибо, что у меня
To
есть
start,
возможность
I
сегодня
would
с вами
like to poll
беседовать.
your experience and view on the
Я
zero-day
для начала
market. If
хотела
you
бы
feel inclined,
узнать
please raise your hand
ваше мнение
and
по
I
поводу
recognize
нулевого
your
дня,
view.
zero дня. Если вы
So,
признаете,
how
пожалуйста,
many of
поднимите
you
руку. Кто из
have heard
вас
stories of people
слышал
or
истории
organization
людей или
who go
организаций,
burn
которые просто
trading vulnerability
подсмотрели
information?
вот это вот на торговле, которые
Anyone?
родились,
Don't be
наверное, от
shy.
того,
Show
что
your hand. I
торгуют
know
вот этой
you
вот
did.
информацией о доступности за нулевого
And
zero дня.
how many of you have ever
Сколько
experienced
из
betrayal,
вас
defection, or extortion
испытывали
in
вот
the
это вот
secretive market?
принуждение, либо какой-то
And
обман
how
на этом
many of you
секретном рынке?
expect to
Кто из
face
вас
any of those
ожидает
obstacles in the future?
вот это вот встретиться с этими
Well,
препятствиями
this
в
next
будущем?
talk deals with such
И
situations.
вот это
And for
сейчас мы
those of
будем об
you
этом
who never
говорить.
heard such stories, and for
И
everyone
для
else
тех,
too,
кто
I have
никогда не
one to
слышал
share.
подобных историй, у меня есть чем поделиться.
Jonathan Stewart has a freelance
Джонатан
job,
Стюарт
a
—
family,
это
and
финансовый
lives in a Phoenix
судья.
suburb featuring stucco houses and manicure lawns. Back in 2013, after spending one of his work
В
days in Redmond,
2013
Jonathan was poking around
Джонатан
on his own when he stumbled into a vulnerability in iOS 7.
в iOS 7 что-то сделал.
Jonathan was security career is old
Его
enough to remember
карьера была достаточно
when his colleagues were
хорошая,
paid
и
zilch, nothing, or
ей
offer a
ничего ему
tiny
не
token
было
for finding vulnerabilities and writing
предложено, даже
exploit for
что
them,
находил
tells about his
уязвимости.
discovery to a few friends
И
because
вот он
he know
злочами этим
he can
занимался,
make some
и
extra
вы
cash from his
можете
work, and he already
какой-то
did in the
дополнительный
past.
доллар заработать на работе,
Meet
и вот
Tai.
он так и делал.
Tai
И
is a vulnerability broker who heard about Jonathan's discovery from another hacker called Jalot,
вот
who is in touch with some people in China.
человека,
The
и
plan is
свел
to
его с
take
людьми
the
в Китае.
Jonathan
То есть
discovery,
план был взять
let Geot
открытие
write an
Джонатана,
exploit for it,
Джон
and sell
напишет
this
там
as a package deal
и
to the
потом
Chinese.
уже продать эту сделку
Meanwhile,
китайцам.
another group of hackers
И
called
еще
evaders
одна
heard
группа
about the same
хакеров
vulnerability and cut
узнала
$1
о
million
той же
deal
самой
with a different
уязвимости
group
и
of
заключила
Chinese
миллион.
businessmen. A Jonathan friend got in touch with them in the hope they could all work together. And you know what? After turning him down, the invaders got to the finish line first, figuring out how to exploit the back door and winning the race. Jonathan never thought that one of his friends would turn on him to sell him out. When he found out, with no rules, no watchdogs, no court system to protect the discovery, Jonathan felt used. Which is to say that trading vulnerability information or zero-day exploits is considered a riskier deal. Players in the secretive market of 0 days face some inherent obstacles related to the time sensitiveness of trade commodities, trust, price fairness, and possibility of defection. Or to put it succinctly, this is an airy business. To begin with, vulnerability information is a time-sensitive commodity or a wasting asset. Zero-day exploits are valuable only when they are not widely known, and their value drops instantaneously to zero as soon as the vulnerability is disclosed or mitigation is released. Therefore, transactions should complete in short times and with the required discretion, or every day can be the last day for a zero-day sale. Yet, in this market, with no centralized way to locate its players, finding buyers and sellers can be time-consuming and may require market participants to have business deals with individuals they are not familiar with, and whose true intentions are hard to verify. Furthermore, even if buyers and sellers manage to find each other with this, negotiating a fair price is often challenging due to a lack of transparency. Adoption levels of vulnerable component, presence within a given attack surface, level of authentication required to exploit the vulnerability, difficulty of independent rediscovery, exploit reliability, and other factors all have an impact on the final price. Still, these are difficult to measure. And the position of the security researcher is further impoverished by the tension that exists between the amount of information they are required to disclose and the risk of losing intellectual property. As it happens for other information goods, proving the validity of vulnerability information without disclosing it is often challenging. There are essentially two approaches, reveal or demonstrate, and they are both undesirable. If the seller reveals something about the vulnerability, the possibility exists for the buyer to take it without paying for it, and vice versa. If the buyer pays for the vulnerability, the seller might run away with the money without supplying the information goods. Demonstrating the validity of a vulnerability via an exploit is not any better. Whoever controls the computing environment has an edge over the other party. On the one hand, if the seller supplies the computing environment, then the possibility exists for the same to tamper with it, leaving the buyer in the position to be unable to verify its integrity. On the other hand, the buyer will be in the position to record the working of the exploit and to steal the intellectual property if the demonstration has to be carried out on the buyer devices. Even worse, any vulnerability claim can be ensured. Upon learning about the vulnerability from the seller, the other party might claim the same vulnerability as their own and sell it or exploit it. As many trades are international and unregulated, it becomes hard to enforce the potential contracts. And finally, sellers may be interested to grant exclusive rights to the buyer in order to receive the largest payoff. But the seller may also defect, selling the same intellectual property to multiple participants. This time, are the buyers to lack a mean to protect themselves? Of course, contracts may include language that force the security researcher to return the money, return the fund, should the same not honor the contractual obligation. But in the zero-day market, the difficulty to identify sellers, to attribute multiple transactions for the same information good to the same supplier, and to enforce contract, help buyers willing to betray. These are obstacles that traditional business and service do not have to face. In order to alleviate some of these hurdles, it was suggested to use punishment to discourage the buyer from defecting in the form of public disclosure of vulnerabilities, resort on the use of trusted third parties as crucial entities for enabling cooperation market participants, a sample which are escrow service, or build a reputation system as an instrument to establish trust relationship between these trustful players, a sample which are reputation score we find on black markets. Today, I will tell you about the first results of an ongoing study on extortion and cooperation in the zero-day market through the lens of game theory. Now, theory is boring, you might say, and precisely because it's boring, I went through it so you don't have to. The questions motivating this research are: can the zero-day market achieve cooperation and efficiency even in absence of trusted third parties, even in absence of escrow service, for instance? Can punishment discourage the buyer from defecting? Under which condition a player can extort the opponent? Can cooperation be sustained also in a fully anonymous setting? And what about semi-anonymous setting? The talk will address this and other questions by providing an analysis of zero-day trading strategies applicable to each scenario. Now, why I'm interested in this, why you may also be interested as well. I work at the intersection of software security and security software, exploring and trying to contain the space of unanticipated state. The choice of my career was dictated by a dream. I dreamed that software manufacturers have the incentive to build security into their products. I dreamed that security researchers have efficient means to capitalize on effort in their security analysis. I dreamed that users have an instrument to hedge against the information security risks they're exposed to. I essentially dreamed that information symmetry is finally established between buyers and sellers in the security market. But that's just me. The reality is that current economic, regulatory, and legal incentives are misaligned, distorted, ineffectual. What we assist today, what we observe today, is what economists call a market failure. And a market failure is about the inability to self-correct. Software manufacturers will not forgo shares. Software users will not forgo features, which translate in greater complexity and in greater attack surface. And attackers will not forgo attacking tens of millions of vulnerable systems. How to invert this market? How do we change? I'm on the record for founding BWise, the first information security prediction market. This was my contribution towards establishing the required incentives. While I didn't succeed so far, there is still hope in me that we can improve our global security posture. In order to understand the market forces behind the zero-day market and the need for our community, I turn my attention to the dynamics in this economy. Understanding the emergence, sustainability, and breakdown of cooperation in the zero-day market is increasingly important. As our society grows more interconnected, it becomes more interdependent within itself. And the more interdependence, the greater the dynamic range of possible failures. Hence, it comes as no surprise that vulnerability information is key for both offensive and defensive purposes. Zero-day exploits are gaining a prominent role in modern-day intelligence, national security, and law enforcement operation. Nation-state actors are buying vulnerabilities. Security scholars propose the intelligence and law enforcement communities to use zero-day hacking as a alternative mean to address their need to access communication. And the underground community, as well as the surveillance and defense industries, happily respond. Which is to say that this work finds application in a number of markets for vulnerability information and zero-day exploits. They range from over-the-counter zero-day trading to boutique exploit providers offering zero-day vulnerabilities for a subscription fee, to service models for vulnerability research. In order to understand extortion and cooperation in the zero-day market, we need to understand the story of the bazaar, the Maharaja ultimatum, and the shade of the future. This is the story of the dilemma faced by zero-day market participants who are each given the incentive to exploit each other. Few preliminaries and definitions are due. The ultimatum game is a game in economic experiments. The first player, the proposer, receives a sum of money and proposes how to divide the sum between himself and another player. A second player, the responder, chooses to either accept or reject the proposal. If the responder accepts, the money is split according to the proposal. If he rejects, neither player receives any money. The prisoner dilemma is the canonical game study in game theory that shows how two purely rational individuals may not cooperate, even if it appears that it's their best interest to do so. In the prisoner dilemma, two prisoners commit a crime. If they both do not confess, they get a low punishment. If they both confess, they get a more severe punishment. If one confesses and the other does not, then the one that confesses gets a very low punishment and the other one gets a very severe punishment. The iterated prisoner dilemma is a repeat game, where the prisoner dilemma game is the stage game. Agents play the prisoner dilemma game an indefinite number of times. Now, in order to model zero-day trades, I'm using a new game I call the zero-day dilemma. And the zero-day dilemma is as follows. There's a zero-day seller and a buyer.
У нас и покупатель, есть продавец.
Apply the zero-day and pay for the same. They both receive a reward payoff, R. Here. If they both defect, respectively retaining the intellectual property and the money, they both receive a punishment payoff, P. If the buyer pays for the vulnerability and the seller defect, then the buyer receives a sucker payoff, S, and the seller a temptation payoff, T. However, if the seller supplied the zero-day and the buyer defects, then three options became available to the betrayed participant. The seller may either opt to accept the betrayal, this is what I call a submissive scenario, or to pursue two paths for immatched retaliation. A first avenue of retaliation is to close alternative deals for the same intellectual property with other buyers. This is what I call an adaptive scenario. A second avenue of retaliation, resembling the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, is to publish the zero-day and negate its value to the exploiter, minimizing the window opportunity associated with the discovered vulnerability. This is what I call the match scenario. Both in match retaliation approach work as long as the vulnerability information is fresh. Now, the payoff for the three scenarios are as follows. In the submissive scenario, the seller receives the sucker payoff S and the buyer the temptation payoff T. In the adaptive scenario, the seller receives the expired payoff Z and the buyer the refurbished payoff U. In the third and last scenario, the seller receives again the sucker payoff S, but the buyer receives a residual payoff V. The following condition holds for the payoff. The temptation payoff is strictly greater than the reward payoff. The reward payoff is strictly greater than the punishment payoff. The reward payoff is strictly greater also than the refurbished payoff, the residual payoff, and the expired payoff. Finally, the punishment payoff is strictly greater than the sucker payoff. Few remarks. In the submissive scenario, traders are playing the standard price-owner dilemma. The relationship R greater than P implies the mutual cooperation is superior to mutual defection. However, the relationship T greater than R and P greater than S imply that defection is the dominant strategy for both agents, or defection is better than cooperation for one player, no matter how the player opponent may play. In the adaptive scenario, though, neither buyer nor the seller have a dominant strategy. If we assume the spike payoff to be greater than the sucker payoff and the refurbished payoff to be smaller than the reward payoff. In particular, if the betrayed seller has the ability to close alternative deals for the same exploit, selling one-day fully undetectable or one-day private exploit, for instance, then defection is not the dominant strategy anymore. But the market nature plays a role in this capacity. Today, the zero-day market is not a monopsony and is weakly regulated. But starting from the implementation of the Wassenaar arrangement, regulation and law may emerge in this area and may have an impact on the market liquidity. The MED scenario is a variant of the standard price-owner dilemma, where the seller has the ability to negate the buyer the temptation to defect, and he does so by making sure the temptation payoff approach the punishment payoff. Hence, defection is not a dominant strategy only for the buyer. Now, if factors such as market liquidity, export trade regulation, mean time to close a deal prevent the adaptive retaliation approach from being undertaken, then the seller should consider disclosing publicly the exploit or the vulnerability. By doing so, she will not make herself worse off, because she was going to get the sucker payoff anyway. Pretty the other way around. The seller will reduce the buyer incentive to defect in the first place. To this end, it's important for zero-day sellers to have an efficient means for doing full disclosure, not for the sake of bragging rights anymore, but for modern-day brinkmanship. In fact, as faster the disclosure of the vulnerability, as shorter the window opportunity to the exploiter and the smaller the residual payoff. Now, since July 2002, the full disclosure list experienced a fair share of legal troubles along the way. And in a market that will likely see more regulations and law in the coming years, posting on a mailing list may translate in an OPSEC failure if proper steps are not taken in order to ensure the anonymity of the submitter. Which is to say that I will not be surprised to learn about the existence of a zero-day disclosure platform. Researchers could use it for doing full disclosure. Players in the zero-day market could use it to retaliate against the buyer who defects. Insider would turn to it to expose the secretive trading, intrusion, and surveillance technologies. Dubbed Whistle Day or Zero Leaks, if you like. Now, it's worth to note that as long as the seller doesn't play in the submissive scenario, the buyer is not better off defecting. This means that in the one-shot sequential zero-day dilemma, cooperation is possible if the seller moves first and retains the ability to punish the buyer who defects. If this is not the case, the rational outcome is the action profile of mutual defection. The dilemma then is that mutual cooperation yields a better outcome than mutual defection, but is not rational outcome because the choice to cooperate at the individual level is not rational from a self-interest point of view. Therefore, I want to ask you, if no form of punishment can be undertaken by the seller, can cooperative outcome still be sustained as an equilibrium? Now, whenever we speak about equilibria, whenever we have the opportunity to reason about zero-day markets in terms of equilibria, we are speaking about Nash equilibria. Now, John Nash, a hero of modern times, passed away just 2 days ago. So I would like to ask you to join me in giving a warm round of applause to John Nash. That said, speaking about equilibria, the iterated zero-day dilemma is a repeat game where the zero-day dilemma is the stage game. Agents play the zero-day dilemma game an indefinite number of times. Whenever the submissive scenario applies, the iterated zero-day dilemma game reduced to the iterated prisoner dilemma. Therefore, it becomes possible to tap into the extensive theoretical and experimental literature devoted to the study of repeat games and draw some prediction on the emergence, sustainability, and breakdown of cooperation in the zero-day market. I ask you to consider 3 scenarios. the anonymous setting, where traders know the identity of the party they are dealing with, the anonymous setting, where trades takes place among strangers, and the semi-anonymous setting, where either the buyer or the seller is anonymous. It has been well known that since the Robert Oman work published in 1959, that in the anonymous setting, two rational individuals may sustain the cooperative outcome if they face each other an indefinite number of times. More recently, William Preston and Freeman Dyson changed the viewpoint in this game by illustrating the power granted to a sentient player, or a player with a theory of mind. Now, a theory of mind is a poetic way to say that the player realized that her behavior can have an influence, can have an impact on the opponent's strategies. Preston Dyson introduced a new class of trading strategies called zero-determinant strategies, which enforce a linear relationship between the two player scores. Now, zero-determinant strategies have far-reaching consequences for zero-day traders. If one trader is aware of zero-determinant strategies, but the opponent is an evolutionary one, then the former can choose to extort the latter. A player is said to be evolutionary if she possesses no theory of mind, and instead simply seek to adjust their strategy to maximize their own score in response to whatever the adversary is doing. Now, extortion strategies grant a disproportionate number of IPF to the extortionist to the expense of the victim. But it's the victim's best interest to cooperate with the extortionist because she's able to increase their score by doing so. And in so doing, she ends up increasing the extortionist score even more than her own. The victim will never catch up to the extortionist, and she will accede to her extortionist because he pays her to do so. Here we have an example of an extortionist relation, granting 3 times the share of payoff above punishment, P, to X compared to those received by the opponent Y. But how does it work in practice? In practice, if we suppose the reward, temptation, punishment, and sucker payoff to be respectively equal to 3, 5, 1, and 0, and if we assume that I was an extortionist player and you an evolutionary one, I could have played in the following way. If we both cooperate last time, then I cooperate with probability 11/13. If I cheat you last time, then I cooperate again, but with probability 7/26. If you cheated me last time, then I cooperate with probability only 1/2. And if we both defect, I defect. In this way, on the long run, my score -1 will be twice your score -1. I refer you to their paper for the details. But Preston Dyson also showed that if both players are sentient, but only one is knowledgeable about zero-determinant strategies, then the iterated prisoner dilemma reduced to the ultimatum game. Let's suppose both players are sentient, but only one, only the buyer, is knowledgeable about zero-determinant strategies. Then the buyer may try to extort the seller, but the seller will eventually notice that something is amiss. Whenever she tries to improve her score, she ends up improving the buyer's score even more. Now, having a theory in mind, she may eventually decide to sabotage the scores of both in the tentative to change the buyer behavior. The iterated prisoner dilemma then reduced to the ultimatum game, with the buyer proposing an unfair ultimatum, and the seller responding by either acceding or sabotaging both player scores. Finally, Preston Dyson showed that if both players are sentient and witting or zero-determinant strategies, then what they can do is to play what they call a generous zero-determinant strategies. In fact, any tentative to extort the opponent will result in low payoff for both. Therefore, the rational thing to do is to agree on a fair cooperation strategy. They can do that if they unilaterally set the other score to an agreed value, presumably the maximum possible. Whenever they do that, neither player can improve her score by violating the strategy, and each is punished for any purely malicious violation. Similarly to what we've seen for the extortionist relation, here we have a generous relation, granting to the player X 2 times the share of payoff above a reward compared with those received to the player Y. In practice, if we assume the same payoff for the reward, temptation, punishment, and sucker payoff as we did before, 2 players, X and Y, could play in the following way if they know about zero-determinant strategies. If they both cooperate last time, then X cooperates. If X cheated Y last time, then X cooperates again with probability 8/10. If Y cheated X last time, then X cooperates with probability 3/10. And if they both defect last time, then X cooperates, but with probability only 2/10. On average, on the long run, the score of X minus 3 will be twice the score of Y minus 3. But all the results cited so far apply only if the market participants have the ability to recognize the identity of their opponent that they are dealing with. Identification is required to ascribe past action to the same market participant and to choose strategies according to the outcome of past interaction. But nowadays, there are a number of black markets where traders are anonymous. So it's natural to ask, is cooperation possible in anonymous zero-day markets? Do you believe it is? If yes, which institution for monitoring and enforcement promote cooperation in this setting? In an experimental study on anonymous economies, Gabriele Camera and Marco Casari found out that cooperation is high and increased with experience. But they also noticed a low degree of cooperation when subjects see aggregate outcomes without observing identities, as may result from discussing trading experience on anonymous fora. More interestingly, they notice that a costly personal punishment significantly promotes cooperation. In particular, in an experimental treatment, subjects were given the possibility to observe action and outcome on their game and to inflict at a cost a loss in the earnings of the defecting opponent. And they did so by adding a second stage game to the standard prize dilemma, to the one-shot game or their iterated game. Now, the retaliation stage, the second stage, resembles in full the adaptive and meta scenarios of the zero-day dilemma. This is fortunate because it makes their work completely applicable to our zero-day market. In the same treatment, players who observe the opponent defect sometimes employ personal punishment, which is to say match retaliation, while staying in cooperative mode in the following periods. And they collect extensive evidence that players show preference for this kind of retaliation, for match retaliation. Finally, they also found out that personal punishment is efficient because the defectors who had been punished by cooperator were more likely to cooperate in the following periods, which is to say that personal punishment can be understood as a public good. On the one hand, it significantly increased cooperation, and on the other, the subjects that benefit the most are cooperators who punish little or not at all. Now, for the sake of completeness, let's turn our attention to semi-anonymous zero-day markets. If only one party is anonymous, the anonymous counterpart has no ability to know if she already had any deals with the same participant. Therefore, the latter can benefit from being sentenced, from having a theory of mind, and is forced to choose strategies as an evolutionary player would do. Therefore, if the anonymous party knows about zero-determinant strategies, she can once again choose to extort the opponent. And this is really interesting because it shows that while cooperation can emerge in fully anonymous markets, extortion can proliferate in semi-anonymous economies. Therefore, I have some good news, a cautionary note, and 6 recommendations to zero-day traders. These are the key takeaway I would like to leave you with for today. So please bear with me for 1 minute longer. To sum up, zero-day markets can achieve cooperation even in absence of trusted third parties, even in absence of escrow service, for instance. Cooperation can be sustained even when traders are anonymous. Punishment is an effective instrument to discourage traders from defecting, but be careful, because it's possible to get extorted if the adversary knows about zero-determinant strategies, and we simply seek to adjust our strategy to maximize our own profit. Therefore, the 6 recommendations to zero-day traders are the following. First, do not deal with anonymous traders if you cannot ensure your own anonymity. Second, discourage defection by practicing brinkmanship or casting the shadow of the future in every decision of your counterpart. Third, respond. Consider punishing defection to promote cooperation by either closing alternative deals for the same zero-day or publishing the zero-day in order to negate its value to the exploiter. Fourth, let the seller apply the vulnerability first if interested in a one-time deal. Fifth, learn about zero-determinant strategies if playing in the anonymous market, of course. And sixth, for every defect, if you see defection while playing in the anonymous market and have no ability to punish the opponent. And that's pretty much it as far as theory goes. Of course, in order to put this recommendation on firmer scientific grounds, experimental verification needs to be carried out. So if interested, please be in touch. Before wrapping up, I have one last remark to make. In 2 days, I will be speaking about cryptographic backdoors attack in the box in Amsterdam. Therefore, I'm reminded about Vincent van Gogh, that once said, "Though I often in the depth of misery, there is still calmness, pure harmony, and music inside me." Now, if you, like me, believe that insecurity or the presence of unmitigatable surprises is the misery of our time, if you believe that insecurity is the misery of our time, and at the same time, you, like me, are also sanguine about our ability to attain better security trade-off and give to our children the chance to reach confidence in the process to which they will entrust their business, then we can paraphrase Vincent van Gogh and say that though we are often in the depth of insecurity, there is still calmness, pure harmony, and music inside us. Всегда не хватит времени. Спасибо за ваше время. Any questions? Maybe offline? No questions. Okay, thank you.